So tropical forests, what do they have a few things in common. One is that they tend to be warm. They tend to be warm ecosystems. And second, they have a small amount of interannual climate variation. So that they tend to kind of, what that is saying is they sort of have the same climate throughout the year, or at least in terms of temperature. So it's always kind of about the same temperature. There's variation in that, of course, but in the hot tropics, they tend to always be hot. Even within those areas, there'll be there's parts of the year that are hotter than others, but by and large, they're pretty constant. Tropical forests dominate the region bounded by the tropics, by the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. These are areas that are generally frost-free environments. That's not true once you get into the mountains, but I'm going to talk about those too. The other and what happens in the tropics is that they're not always warm, especially when you go up in elevation. But whatever the climate regime is, it tends to be consistent throughout the year. So let's look at some examples. Here's just a map of the distribution of tropical forest ecosystems. You can look at this a little bit more closely. I don't want to dwell on it right now. Some other things about the tropics that are kind of like, I think, familiar about them. These are areas where you can grow agricultural products like coffee and pineapple and tropical fruits. Here's a photograph of cacao in Panama. If you've never seen cacao, it's a source of chocolate. It grows on the main stem. It's a short-statured tree, and the pod grows on the main stem. It's pretty cool. They're neat areas. Anyway, these kinds of things grow in the tropics. Now, not all tropical forests are what might come to mind first, like a wet jungle. Many tropical forests, and the ones that I actually think that are closer in their ecology to the oak forests around San Luis Obispo, and the ones that I actually think that the first ones that I ever experienced were dry tropical forests. These are highly seasonal systems. So they tend to be warm. They tend to be aseasonal in their temperature dynamics, but they are highly seasonal in terms of when water is falling. So they have a long dry period followed by a period of the year that tends to be wet. And one of the characteristics of these forests, very common characteristic, is that they are deciduous ecosystems. The trees and the forests lose their canopy cover, and that is an adaptation to dealing with water limitation. So these are abundant in Mexico, in Africa. They tend to be short-statured and they grow slowly, and they oftentimes have lower or moderate biomass. Excuse me while I silence my phone. This is a distribution of these forests in the New World. Like I say, they're extensive they're pretty extensive in Mexico, and they they occur down in South America also. I've never actually been down there to South America, but they do occur there. Is everybody still with me? Anybody? That totally messed everything up?
No, everything seems to be good.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry. That was my wife calling me, and then she just sent a text that said, "Sorry, you probably have class." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm not gonna text her back until we're done." Oh, geez. Here we are, modern life, and in the middle of a pandemic. Okay, cool. Anyway, this is a photograph of these forests. This is from Oaxaca, Mexico. I was there in the dry time of year. All the foliage is off the trees. These ecosystems tend to flower all at the same time, and they refoliate very quickly once it starts raining. So, and they're fairly common. Here's another picture of this. Is from Monte Alban. There are some evergreen species in there, and so forth. And one of the things I want to point out, I love showing pictures of El Tule. I love to show pictures of El Tule. All the big trees that I've ever visited in the world, I always like to show them. So if you've seen this before, sorry. I'm gonna show it again. This is the this tree has the record of for girth, and the reason I want to point it out here is really near Monte Alban. It occurs in these dry tropical forests, but the reason it's so big is because it's in some deep alluvial soils where it has year-round water availability. And once you remove the water limitation, you can have big trees, lots of biomass and so forth, because it's warm in the tropics and there's a lot of sunshine. So anyway, there's El Tule. Here's another picture of it. That's a really cool tree. It's just in the middle of a town. It's kind of crazy. Anyway, so we'll go on to wet tropical forests. I call this tropical rainforests. It includes that. I think wet tropical forest is probably a better terminology for it. These are aseasonal ecosystems. They're for the most part, they're wet all year. They can have some periods of lower rainfall or periods where they're relatively dry. Even wet tropical forests exist on a gradient of aseasonality. Some ecosystems are simply they seem to be wet all year long. It rains any day of the year, and sometimes a lot. And others tend to be seasonally dry, but not quite rising to that level of dry tropical forests like I just showed. So here are some examples. This is probably the wettest forest that I've ever been to. This is La Selva in Costa Rica. It gets the big storms that happen in the winter, but then it also just, because of the topography and the position and some air currents and the structure of the forest, it rains there all the time. It just does. I was there for a couple days. I think it rained every day, at least a little bit. It's a very productive system. La Selva itself is an pretty old forest. It's the only old growth tropical forest that I've been to. And the image on the right is a big tree with a big cavity in it. It's rotted out. It's kind of cool. Lots of biomass, stuff grows fast. It's really diverse. There's lots and lots of species, not just of plants, but of insects and birds and all that stuff too. Like I said, there's a gradient here. This is an example of humid and seasonally wet tropical forests. I was just in the Philippines over the Christmas holiday. This is pretty cool. These forests, they tend to have more pronounced, it can rain any time of year, but they have a more pronounced dry season, which is when I was there. And you got these trees like with really cool buttress roots, and there's some bamboo there. And there's a picture of a small child with a massive leaf. It's just an example of what these places look like. But the thing that they do have in common, like I said, it rained on us that day. There's precipitation pretty much throughout the year. They're warmer, and they're warmer. And there's certainly no frost in a place like this. Here's one last example from Vietnam. This is lowland Vietnam, and two things I'll point out about this landscape has been completely converted into a plantation. And second, when I think back to my time there, I just think about how dang hot it was. It was really hot. This area has been totally converted to eucalyptus plantation. And in the upper left-hand corner of the photograph, you can see these kind of orange soils. Those are pretty typical these wet tropical ecosystems where the soils become very weathered and depleted of nutrients. So pretty typical wet tropical forest conditions here. And here's just one more example. These happen in North America as well. This is Chiapas, Mexico. These tend to be a little bit drier, but still in that sort of wet, for wet tropical forests, but still would classify in the same designation. Okay, so like I say, everything that I've been showing you so far are tropical forests that are relatively warm. However, there are many tropical forests where frosts are common. And just like anywhere else in the world, when you move up slope, when you move up, especially up high, high mountains or any significant amount of relief. So I would say, once you move up 300 meters, 1,000 feet, or so, so forth, you're going to have a lower precipitation and a tendency for, you're gonna have tendency for lower temperatures and higher precipitation. Lower temperatures mean higher likelihood of occurrence of frost. You see this throughout the world. The photograph behind here is a picture from Guatemala. This is a relatively tall mountain, Tajumulco, which is I think 13,000 feet. I remember the air was thin up there. As you move up the slopes here, you get out of areas where you can say grow bananas or even avocados, and into areas that are cold. Fewer people live up there. The forests it becomes dominant forests, and the forests in particular are all adapted to two things. One, the area is actually fairly dry or has pronounced dry season, but two, that there's frosts all the time. In the tropics, as you move up, especially in the aseasonal tropics, it becomes summer every day and winter every night. There's no summer and winter. It just happens. Well, there is. It just happens. It just happens every day. So, like I say, in some parts of the tropics, in the high mountains, frosts or even snowfall might happen every day of the year, and the plants are adapted to that. And in this case, these forests are dominated by conifers. Conifers are good at tolerating those conditions. Sorry. Montane forests are not always dry like that. This is a montane cloud forest. This is going back to Costa Rica here. Humid and often wet forests. When these forests are wet enough, they'll be dominated by broadleaf species. That's another thing that we see when we look across forest types across the world. You have a tendency, if you have consistent precipitation, you have a shift. You tend to have a shift from needle leaf conifer species into broadleaf species, and I'll show you some funny exceptions to that. But and I apologize. This is the best photograph that I have of these ecosystems. They're really difficult to photograph because the light levels are always low. But it kind of gives you, I think you can imagine what these places are like. They're cooler and they're really humid. They're kind of like being in a cold fog all the time. Anyway, they're pretty neat. There are other kinds of variation here, and this is in Vietnam, kind of moving up into the Yunnan Plateau, into the foothills of the Himalayas here. These forests here have regular frosts, but they're wetter, so they're dominated by broadleaf species, but they're still adapted to frosts. In fact, you might not expect to find a forest that gets regular snowfall in a place like Vietnam, but this is near the town of Sapa, Vietnam, just right in the farthest north part of the country and the border with China. and the mountains are pretty high. It's, I think I'm at 9,000 feet here, and there's snowfall regularly in this area. The forests, kind of cool. They're relatively wet, even though there's pronounced periods of cold. The forests have a lot of species in the oak family, have alder, elms, rhododendron, a lot of, a number of genera and plants, trees, and families that are probably not familiar to you, but actually a surprising number of plants that you might be surprised, even if that many of these species or their families at least would be familiar to you. I was really surprised when I visited this forest. I felt like, oh, okay. I'd never been to Southeast Asia, and I was kind of hiking around here and was like, oh, this looks more familiar than I thought it would. And then here's one more example of these cloud forests, and this is going back to Guatemala. This is on Volcan Santa Maria in the highlands near Xela. That's Quetzaltenango, Guatemala. These forests are humid. They're high elevation, they get regular frosts, but they're relatively dry. They don't get as much rainfall precipitation. And something kind of interesting happens in these places, that you have a shift towards conifer dominance. And that's in part because it's drier, and also because some aspects of the combination of temperature and precipitation. It's just another example of the variation in this forest type. I'll just just a little bit of trivia. These forests have the highest diversity of pinus, genus Pinus, in the world. They have one fir species in them. They're really neat. Yeah, just really interesting part of the world.